Chapter 7 Vicam Station? I had not slept well. The dreams I had were so vivid that they could have actually happened. I woke up feeling exhausted, for I had been walking over hilly terrain all night. Over breakfast, I asked Carlos to tell me where we were going and what I was to expect upon getting there. All I can say is that I'm going to take you to meet some people, he said matter-of-factly. And there is no way of knowing what to expect when we get to the party, because power is unpredictable. The party? What kind of party? A gathering, a fiesta, Carlos said, as he signaled the waitress for the check. In that case, I'd better change into something more suitable, I told him. While Carlos paid the check, I hurried back to my room to change. The only dressy clothes in my travel bag were a beige linen skirt and a sleeveless silk blouse I had purchased with the money Nelida had left me. I had put the garments in the bag at the last moment with no thought of ever wearing them. Now I put them on quickly and hurried out the door. Carlos was standing by the car, checking the coolant under the hood. Where exactly is this party? I asked, trying to keep a lid on my excitement. In the Yaqui town of Bakum, he said, closing the hood with a bang. As I told you, I want you to meet some people I've been associated with. They are having a small gathering in your honor. My honor? But I've never met them, have I? No, you haven't. But they are anxious to meet you. Why? Did you tell them about me? When did you see them? We had not left each other's company since we had crossed the border. Unless Carlos had slipped out of his room during the night, there was no way he could have met anyone. Perhaps someone had telephoned or sent him a message. A strange agitation possessed me. The only people I knew in Mexico were Clara, Nelida, and Mr. Abelar, and of course Emilito, who I was certain was not one to attend social gatherings. I can't wait to meet them, I said excitedly. Do I look all right? Carlos scanned me from head to toe. Don't you have some proper walking shoes? I can't wear hiking boots with this outfit, I said. It would ruin the look. I realized that I was going to great lengths to impress the people I was going to meet, to the extent of wearing uncomfortable dress sandals. But I wanted to look elegant, not as though I had been trekking in the desert with one outfit to my name. Besides, Carlos had stipulated that the party was in someone's house and that we were going to drive there. I didn't see too much walking on the agenda. All right then, let's go, Carlos said. I got in the car, trying hard not to wrinkle my skirt. We drove out of Guamas, then headed southeast toward the Yaqui towns. It was obvious that Carlos had driven on Mexican roads many times, for the car hugged the road as he negotiated the curves in an expert manner. Nevertheless, every time the road disappeared around a bend, I held my breath, hoping that we would not be surprised by an oncoming truck or bus passing in our lane. Placed along the roadside as a constant reminder of a tragic mishap were wooden crosses or shrines with wilted flowers, marking the spot where a car had gone off the road, or there had been a collision, or a person had accidentally been run down. To my distress, these morbid memorials were disturbingly numerous. We came to a small town made up of a cluster of adobe houses with doors opening into dark rooms that looked like caves. In an open courtyard delineated with cane fences, I spotted a fat white chicken taunted by two smaller reddish hens. Next to a house was a rust-covered car with no wheels, the remnants of an accident, and having been abandoned there, was never moved again. Is this one of the Yaqui towns? I asked. No, this is Empalme. The Yaqui towns are further ahead. Bacum, where we are headed, is one of the 8 pueblos regarded by the Yaquis as being located on sacred ground. The Rahum Chronicles list them as having been established before the coming of the Spaniards. What is the Rahum Chronicles? It is a list of memorable dates in Yaqui history. According to the chronicle, there were 4 great men who called the people together and led them around the boundaries of Yaqui country. They went to Cabora on the Cacoraki Arroyo, from there to Tacalame, the peak just north of Huamas. As they went along the boundary, they preached and sang with the people, thus establishing the boundary line of Yaqui territory. After that, they founded the 8 pueblos. Singing of the boundary and establishing the towns sometime in the remote past is the solemn belief about the origin of their tribal territory. What are the other 7 towns? I asked. Cocorit, Vicam, Torim, Potam, Rahum, Huirivas, and Belem, Carlos said. They were situated along the lower 60 miles of the Yaqui River. But during the late 19th century, the main channel of the Yaqui River below Potam shifted sharply, and Belem was left completely without water, and the water supply to Huirivas and Rahum was severely curtailed. What happened to the people in these places? They had to relocate elsewhere. Many were given land by the people of Potam. Others moved to Empalme or started new settlements. But with the steady encroachment of Mexicans into their lands, most of the Yaquis had left the original sites, such as Bacum, and have set up new villages elsewhere, often with the same name. The same thing happened in Vicam. A new village center called Vicam Station was established on the railroad in Vicam territory. However, the majority of the people now living there are Mexicans. We passed another settlement. More clusters of low, flat-roofed adobe houses surrounded by cane fences, held in place with crooked posts. A fat woman with a shawl over her head stood in a doorway, watching the cars passing on the highway. Next to the house were a pair of dusty gray donkeys, tethered in a small corral with a sloping ramada. An old man who could barely make it up the hill was pushing a 4-wheel cart full of manure. Elsewhere, a group of men were standing near the roadside, as if waiting for a bus or truck to come along and pick them up and take them to Huamas. They waved at us as we passed. A mangy dog barked and ran after the car as we slowed down for a curve. Then we speeded up and left the dog biting a cloud of dust. Around noon, Carlos turned off the main highway onto a well-packed dirt road. We drove through the heat and dust to a small cluster of adobe houses placed in a haphazard fashion with no regular block or street plan. Some of the houses had corrugated tin roofs with adobe walls. They were lined up one against the other in a group of 4 or 5 room additions that would allow an extended family to live together. Sometimes a cane fence shut them off completely from their neighbors. Is this where the Yaqui Indians live? I asked, rolling up my window so the dust wouldn't get in the car. Carlos pointed in the opposite direction. No, the Yaqui Indians live on the other side of the highway, behind those cane fences we saw earlier as we drove up. The Mexicans, or Yorims, as the Yaquis called them, live in these houses. Carlos said that Mexican houses in Vicam Station were better built than those on the other side of the main highway. These had cement floors, some electricity, and families owned television sets, radios, bicycles, and sometimes even a car or a truck. What about the Yaqui Indians? How do they live? I asked. Their houses have dirt floors, no electricity, and they have to bring in water from the wells of irrigation ditches in 5-gallon gasoline cans, Carlos replied. Even here, it seems that it's important to be born on the right side of the highway, I said. The entire world is divided into the haves and the have-nots. Carlos said that demarcations and comparisons were universal, that there were always people who had those that didn't, no matter how poor they were. There were always people who had and those that didn't, no matter how poor they were. Dichotomies are a part of the human condition, he explained. They are built into language, which is based on contrast and opposition, like day and night, male and female. Hot dogs and hamburgers, I added. He gave me a quizzical look. I told Carlos that as children, on hot summer days, my brothers and I used to run through the sprinklers naked. They would tease me saying that I didn't have a hot dog appendage the way they had. They said mine looked like a hamburger. When I insisted that hamburgers were better than hot dogs, they immediately demonstrated the contrary by peeing in perfect arcs. When I tried futilely to do the same, they laughed because I could only tinkle straight down. They had convinced me that I was born without something essential, I told Carlos, that I was deficient, and that feeling dogged for me, and that feeling dogged me for the rest of my life. I felt cheated for not having been born a male. Hot dogs aren't any better than hamburgers, Carlos said, laughing. You have been fooled by the authority and certainty that males have as children, that they are superior by virtue of the fact that they are desired by their parents, whereas females usually are not. Males depart from a more privileged position, but we are not intrinsically superior. I remembered Clara assuring me of the same fact. The womb is the giver of life, she had said. It can create, be a source of strength, move things, and make things happen. You're a fool to blindly accept a position of inferiority without question. Why not accept a position of strength and confidence instead? The womb can give you all that and more. It is the organ of life itself. A group of children ran after the car, playfully hurling small rocks at it. Carlos parked in front of a house with a blue curtain covering the entrance. Instantly, young boys crowded around the car, stroking it and kicking the tires. Others kept their distance and watched wide-eyed as we stepped out of the car. "Is this where the party is?" I asked, avoiding the eyes of the children. Carlos shook his head. "No, but I have to pay my respects to some friends first. They've always been very kind to me." A woman wearing a white embroidered blouse and a long faded blue skirt and maroon apron came out to greet us. Her skin was brown and smooth, and her eyes were shiny, black, and friendly. Carlos introduced her as Doña Mercedes, who smiled warmly as she grasped my hand in a firm handshake. She pulled the curtain aside and invited us inside her home. The room was semi-dark. The walls were of stucco, and the cement floor had been recently swept with water. I was surprised how cool it was. A reddish curtain tacked to the window gave the room a mellow glow. The curtain fluttered in the breeze and let light through as it billowed away from the window. Through an open doorway, I could see an iron cot, like the ones lined up in army barracks. A chest of drawers with an altar on top stood next to the bed. I saw a crucifix draped with a rosary and a picture of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Leaning against it was a photograph of a young man. The shrine was flanked with flowers and 2 lighted white votive candles. All I could think was that somebody had recently died, for it looked like a shrine to the memory of a departed family member. We sat down on a maroon sofa that had lost most of its stuffing. I kept sinking in deeper until I hit a hard board. The springs were poking my bottom uncomfortably, but I thought it would be impolite to stand up and sit elsewhere. 2 girls around 8 and 10 from time to time poked their heads into the room from behind the blue curtain and let out exuberant giggles. Carlos stopped his conversation with Doña Mercedes long enough to play peekaboo with the girls. Then the hostess said something to Carlos in rapid Spanish I could not follow. "Doña Mercedes says Benny should be back any moment," Carlos said. "He just went to the store to buy some sodas." "Did he know we were coming?" I asked. "Someone had seen the car on the road," he replied, "so he knew we would be stopping by his house the way I always do." I was eager to meet Benny, Doña Mercedes' youngest son. Carlos had said he was in his mid-20s and that sometimes when he did field work in Wickham, he stayed in the back room, which Benny occupied when he was not away constructing irrigation ditches for the huge cooperative farms owned by the Mexican government. His older brother, Raul, had recently died in a landslide while dynamiting to build a tunnel through a hill. "Is this the Benny who wants the shower?" I whispered to Carlos. Carlos nodded. On our drive from Guamas, he had told me a story about a friend of his whose dream was to live in the United States. He said that every time he visited his house, Benny begged Carlos to hide him in the trunk of his car and smuggle him across the border. Carlos had always refused, but this did nothing to impede their friendship. Benny had felt fate had dealt him a harsh blow for allowing him to be born on the wrong side of the Rio Bravo, especially when his mother, who while pregnant with him had been visiting relatives in Tucson, could have had her child there, thereby making him a citizen of the United States. He was constantly talking about going north, boasting that he had made it to Arizona twice, but had been caught and deported. Benny knew what kind of cars Americans drove, the large houses they lived in, and he had even been in the well-stocked department stores in Phoenix. One day, coming home from working in the fields, Benny was washing up in the back of his house over a water trough. He again asked Carlos to hide him in the trunk of his car when he left for the United States the following day. "I'd give an arm and a leg to have a decent shower," Benny had told him. Carlos assured his friend that although he couldn't take him to the United States, his second dream would be fulfilled. He would have the shower of his dreams. Benny looked surprised. "That's impossible," he said. "No, really," Carlos had insisted. "When I was a boy, I had helped my grandfather build a shower on his farm. I'll build one just like it for you." Carlos had described how he could connect a pipe to the water storage tank in the back of the house. With a series of pulleys and with the help of gravity, the water would run into a smaller tank outside the cooking area. A chain hooked up to a plug, when released, would allow the water to rush through a shower head with enough pressure to douse whoever stood underneath. He would even build a cane barrier for privacy and allow the water to be collected in a trough below for recycling. You're crazy," Benny said, after listening to Carlos's plans. "What kind of shower is that? I may as well bathe in the irrigation ditch." Carlos admitted that he was stunned. "I want a real shower with tile walls, a glass door, with swans engraved on it, like I saw in the Home and Garden magazine. And real plumbing with hot and cold water all year round." Carlos confessed that it had not occurred to him that that was what his friend had in mind. He had to admit that Benny was right. Such a shower was impossible to construct where he lived. "Were you still friends after that?" I had asked. "Yes, but the gifts I always brought with me, the clothes for his two sisters, the radios, the portable TV, always seemed inadequate." Doña Mercedes' curtain opened and a tall, slim young man with a winning smile entered, wearing American Levi's, a black leather jacket, and a baseball cap. He embraced Carlos by repeatedly slapping both palms on his back. He glanced at me, sitting on the sofa, then smiled shyly as we were introduced. After exchanging a few English phrases, he seemed to have exhausted his repertoire, and the conversation reverted back to Spanish. Through an opening in the curtain, I watched the girls playing outside. At one point, Doña Mercedes took me to the back porch area covered by a ramada. It was also the kitchen area where food was cooking in huge aluminum pots over a pit lined with stones. To the side, I could see a water holding tank. I scrutinized the area with my contractor's eyes, wondering if it would be possible to construct a shower. There was adequate space, but of course, no plumbing. I thought of the beautiful bathroom in Clara's house, with water mysteriously running under the floor. The water had been piped in from a natural underground spring, but there was no running water around Benny's house, except the water from the well, whose use was restricted and had to be brought to the house in a bucket. I realized that to build a shower in Benny's house was an impossible undertaking. The entire community would have to be renovated. After a polite interval, we got up and said goodbye. Benny came with us to accompany us part of the way. He said we needed him to give us directions, for the roads were not marked and we could easily get lost if we left the highway. Besides, he too wanted to visit Bacum, where his favorite uncle lived. As we drove, Carlos talked with Benny in the front seat. I could tell Carlos was getting nervous. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, as if he were clenching his fists. At first, I thought it was because Benny had hitched the ride. But then I concluded it was our destination that made him nervous. I, too, was ill at ease. After a thorough recapitulation, I came to the conclusion that I was never fond of social gatherings because I was too stiff, too afraid of making a fool of myself. Later, I had a bona fide reason for not to get entangled with people and their enterprises. Both Clara and Emilito had warned me not to fall prey to the mesmeric commands governing social interaction. The only thing a man is after, Clara had said with her customary frankness, is to maneuver a woman into a position where he can leave his luminous worms inside her body. "What are you talking about?" I demanded. Clara explained that during the sex act, a man leaves his energy inside a woman's body. These luminous worms, as she had called them, by feeding off the energy of the woman, force her to support her man energetically against her will or her knowledge. Sorcerers don't waste their sexual energy, but store it to be used for dreaming or stalking. Both of these activities take enormous amounts of energy, Clara said. Our basic energy is our sexual energy. We must not dissipate it in a momentary exchange with someone we don't give a hoot about. She said that women are mesmerized by men on an energetic level. Only by recapitulating her life can a woman free herself from the burden of having to continually place her energy at the disposal of men. The car suddenly swerved onto a dirt road and nearly collided with a giant saguaro cactus that had fallen onto its side. From then on, the ride was bumpy. I rolled up the window so the dust wouldn't get into the car and scanned the terrain through the insect-spotted glass. I expected to see a colonial mansion like Clara's, hidden among the dense shrubs and mesquite groves. But all I saw was a cluster of houses made of sun-dried mud brick, held together with packed straw, the typical construction of the area. Carlos parked the car on a gravel shoulder. "Are we here?" I asked, lamely. "I don't see any place big enough for a party." "We have to let Benny off here," he said. "This is where his uncle lives." We said goodbye and promised to meet again the next day to look for Pascolo masks Carlos wanted to donate to the university's ethnographic museum. Then Benny gave the car's fender a firm pat, as if to send it on its way, and we continued on the road for a few more miles. In front of a wall of dense shrubbery, we stopped again. "We have to walk a bit," Carlos said, getting out of the car. My heart sank at the thought of walking through the underbrush in my dress sandals. But we walked. Or rather, Carlos walked. I hobbled behind him like a lame mule. My linen skirt was covered with dust, and my bare arms scratched from the underbrush. "I have to take off my nylons," I said, after about 20 minutes of trekking. "They have too many runs in them. I can't show up with polka dot legs." Carlos agreed. I stepped behind a fallen tree and discreetly removed my pantyhose and took the opportunity to urinate out of sheer nervousness. I stuffed the nylons into my shoulder bag and caught up with Carlos, who was looking at a small cactus down the path. I had no idea where we were going. All I could do was to follow Carlos, cool and comfortable in his long-sleeved shirt and Levi's. I envied the agility with which he walked over the uneven terrain in his hiking boots. From time to time, he held aside a tree branch or a thorny shrub as we passed. "Can't we go back to the car to change my shoes?" I asked, knowing we couldn't. I really wanted to go further than that. I wanted to drive to a motel, check in, and sit under the shade of an umbrella by the pool, sipping a cool soda. "No, we can't go back," he said decisively. "They're expecting us, and we're late as it is." I began to pout. "We're almost there," he said reassuringly. The smell of smoke made me pick up my pace, for I knew we were nearing habitation. My stomach was growling. I had worked up a ferocious appetite. I was wondering if I would be able to eat the food or if I would have to settle for politely nibbling, when I heard Carlos say, "I see they've already started the festivities. Hurry, they're expecting us." We crossed a wooden bridge over a gully. There was water under it in the arroyo. The broken planks creaked as we passed. I paused to look down. The water was muddy and slow-moving. It looked like a stream of running milk chocolate. It must have come down from the area of the Obregon Dam, where there was a reddish clay deposit. The river of chocolate, I dubbed it, for it looked like thick coca. Then I saw the house nested among a clump of manzanilla trees. It was not a beautiful estate like Clara's, but a group of humble adobe huts. Children and chickens ran in the courtyard. A mangy dog was scrounging for scraps. Around the side of the house, a donkey was tied to a stake in the ground, being able to graze only as far as the rope around his neck would allow him. I felt a moment of sheer terror. I was no different from that donkey with a noose around its neck that didn't allow it to move beyond the limits of its known world. Yet, we're all like that. If we pulled on the rope too hard, we would strangle ourselves. We have means at our disposal to cut our ties, yet fear prevents us from ever trying. And even as we cut one rope, another rope becomes visible. In a gigantic knot tied with an infinite number of ropes, all serving the same purpose, to hold us fixed and not allow us to stray from the life into which we were born. As I crossed the creaky bridge on shaky steps, I knew Clara or Nelida would not be among the invited guests. I would not meet them here today. Chapter 8. The Fiesta. The houses were marked by a path of round river rocks. A cooking fire was burning nearby. I could smell the familiar scent of mesquite wood smoke, common to that area. We followed the narrow lane to the back of a house which had a single window with no glass or screen. A ramada-covered unopened kitchen where cooking implements and baskets hung from nails pounded into the two outside posts. Corn tied in bundles lay on top of the awning to dry in the sun. Underneath the ramada, two women were preparing food over an open grill. One was seated on a plank bench in front of a matate. She was flattening tortillas in her palms, then placing them in the skillet to cook over the fire. The other woman took charge of turning them over and removing them when they were done. Relatives or guests sat on orange crates turned on their sides, or they stood in small groups drinking sodas. Chickens and a couple of mean-looking dogs had the run of the compound. A girl, 6 or 7, dressed in Levi's overalls and a dirty t-shirt, was eating corn on the cob near the threshold. I stood there, surrounded by strange sights and sounds and a horde of smiling people. All I could think of was that my feet hurt, for a tiny pebble had wedged itself between the straps of my sandals. I regretted that I had not put on proper walking shoes. I wanted to look stylish, but everything seemed to have conspired against me. My hair had become undone. My skirt was wrinkled. My blouse was torn, and I was perspiring profusely. Everyone embraced Carlos as if he were an old friend. As I was introduced to them, they looked me over and politely shook my hand. They seemed happy to meet me. They complimented my clothes and examined the color and texture of my hair, as if I were a monkey in a zoo. One woman looked concerned at the scratches on my arms. The little girl was shy and avoided me altogether. A dog came and urinated at my feet, and one of the ladies had to apologetically shoo it away. A petite woman with a long black braid down her back and pointed white teeth asked me to sit down on an orange crate and hospitably handed me a soda. I thanked her, and after surreptitiously wiping off the top of the open bottle, I took a sip. The conversation began, and I looked on as everyone spoke in rapid Spanish. Whenever anyone addressed me directly, I smiled and shrugged. Incapable of using the phrases I had learned in my conversation classes, I realized that those classes had not prepared me for real social interaction, where everyone talked at once in an animated way. I passed the time watching a group of recently hatched chicks pecking the dirt floor. It was strange to see chickens and dogs running around what must have been the family's living quarters. I wondered if I had the constitution or stamina to live under such conditions for an extended period of time. Carlos laughed and was totally at ease and engaging as he told stories. From time to time, he nodded at me, indicating that I was the topic of conversation. Everyone looked at me and smiled, and I smiled back, nodding, wondering what they were saying. A young man asked him a question. The laughter stopped, and everyone's gaze fell on me. I felt as if they were waiting for me to say something, but I hadn't the foggiest idea what that might be. So I just nodded, and everyone laughed louder. They're wondering how we met, Carlos explained. I told him that you are a student of anthropology and that I am your professor. The people smiled and giggled. Has he taught you what he knows how to do best? Whispered a woman behind me. I was shocked to hear English spoken, and I turned around. It was the woman from the restaurant in Santa Ana, the lady who had been filling in for her sister. I hadn't recognized her before, for now her hair was braided, and she was wearing a white embroidered dress. I stared at her dumbfounded, trying to figure out the meaning of her question and what she was doing at the party. I had assumed incorrectly that no one at the gathering spoke English. As I stared at her, I realized that her sparkling eyes were amber, not black, and that she had olive skin, and that she was really very beautiful. For the first time, I saw her as a person, not just as a generic Mexican or an Indian. Her mean stare made me realize that I never looked at people directly, but only at their outlines, their general shapes, and that I only gave the impression that I was looking at them. It wasn't that I couldn't see well or needed glasses. On the contrary, I prided myself on my 20/20 vision. It was more of a case of being afraid or too self-absorbed to look at anyone in the eye, for I didn't want anyone to look at me. I realized that in spite of my belief that I wanted to be noticed, I also wished very much to remain hidden. I wanted to ask the woman what she meant by her comment, but she had already moved away. I returned my attention to the main group. The conversation seemed endless. The wooden crate beneath me was numbing my tailbone. After a while, I was no longer paying attention, nor bothering to pretend that I was listening. I felt like an outsider, as if I had been thrown into a raging river in which it was pointless to try to swim. No more fake smiles and nervous chuckling, pretending I was having a good time. I felt I was pouting and on the verge of getting up and going for a walk, even though I knew it would have been rude to do so. What's worse, self-pity and discontent were creating an internal dialogue that was anything but friendly. I was annoyed with Carlos for bringing me to a place where no one paid any attention to me. Carlos had intimated that I would be the guest of honor, but after the initial curiosity wore off, I was all but ignored. Besides, I had expected a lively party in a house with plenty of music and good things to eat. Soft sofas, maybe even a hired mariachi group playing an old Mexican favorite, with perhaps a tango thrown in for a continental flair. And deep down, I had expected to see Clara and Nelida and Mr. Abelar. As I began to focus on my profound disappointment, I became increasingly morose. After a while, I noticed some black spots flying in the air around me. At first, I thought the heat and my fatigue had caused my eyes to play tricks on me. But looking closer, I saw that the spots seemed to be jumping up from the ground about 3 feet into the air. Lulled into a stupor by the foreign sounds, I occupied myself following the movements of the black specks. They seemed to be everywhere, shooting off at random. As soon as one landed, another one bounced up. It was odd that no one else in the room took notice of them. I was relieved when a robust Indian woman in a blue dress, who seemed to be the hostess, stood up and suggested we all move to a table under some trees where carnitas and beans were being served. The lady piled some roast pork on a plate, along with a ladle of beans and rice, and handed it to me with a bent fork. As I was eating, I felt that my legs were beginning to itch. I thought that there must be mosquitoes flying around under the table, so I tried to brush them away with a hand. One of the women noticed my movements and made some comment about keeping one's hands above the table in polite circles. Everyone laughed except me. I didn't dare examine my legs in front of everyone, but when I casually put a hand to my calf, I felt that my legs were full of bumps. I began to scratch until the hostess noticed me and looked at my legs. I saw then that they were completely covered with bites. It dawned on me that the jumping black specks that had entertained me earlier during the conversation had been giant flies feasting on my bare legs. Never before had I seen fleas. Giant fleas. Never before had I seen fleas so big and so numerous and so vicious. A striking woman with jet black hair pulled back into a bun, got up, grabbed my hand, and led me inside an adjacent house. Carlos followed and assured me not to worry, because if I was going to get bitten by anything, I was in the right place. The woman whose house I was in was a powerful sorceress. She gave my hand a squeeze, as if to reaffirm what Carlos had said. She had high cheekbones, a strong, wide mouth, and smooth, coffee-colored skin drawn tightly over her face, giving her an eerie mask-like appearance. She looked a bit groggy, too, as if she had just awoken from a long sleep. Her name is Zulika, Carlos said. With an imperceptible movement of her chin, Doña Zulika signaled for Carlos to sit on a bench near the door, as if to stand guard, and led me to sit on a chair and prop my legs on a stool. She examined my legs and shook her head and clicked her tongue as if she didn't like what she saw. Then she said something to Carlos in rapid Spanish. Zulika says the flea bites are a bad omen, Carlos said. What do you mean by a bad omen? I asked. It means your life will be difficult, filled with many obstacles along the way, Carlos said. Unless you stop your overwhelming concern with the self, troubles will feast on you the way the fleas have attacked your legs. I cringed. It was all I needed to be. More obstacles, as if there weren't enough hurdles to overcome. Doña Zulika looked at me sympathetically and said something about staying with her so she could heal me. She wants me to tell you that there is a way to avoid trouble, Carlos continued. But for that, you will have to change. She says you will have to be reborn. I did not understand in what way I could change. I had done a thorough recapitulation of my life, beginning from the present and moving backwards to my very first memories. Then I had done another one, moving forward from my very first memories to the present. And what was so bad with the way I was living anyway? I wondered. I was going to school, grooming a romance with knowledge, the way Emilito had recommended. I felt I was doing everything I needed to be. And yet Zulika's grim prognosis frightened me. Doña Zulika looked directly into my eyes and said something more. I turned to Carlos, bewildered. She wants to help you, he said. She says that unless you stop pampering yourself, the bit of power that you have stored will turn against you, and you will be worse off than before. What can I do? I asked. Tell me the steps so I can follow them. She says there are no steps, Carlos said. There is only an overall feeling that comes when one has decided wholeheartedly to follow the path of knowledge impeccably. Zulika says that you still lack that feeling. I let out a sigh of sheer defeat. I didn't even have the energy to argue. She could help you get stronger, but you would have to stay with her, Carlos said. Personally, he added, I would advise against that. Why shouldn't I? I asked. And just to be contrary, added, it sounds like a good idea. I had not intention of staying in a flea-ridden place with a woman who looked like she was either groggy or drunk. On top of that, from the way she peered at me, I could tell there was a streak of madness in her that she could not disguise. I had seen that look before in Emilito, and at times in myself. Zulika is a master dreamer, he said. You're not used to her touch. It might do you more harm than good. I had no idea what he was talking about, so I remained silent. I scanned the room. A mattress was on the floor, covered with burlap bags. Baskets of dried herbs and roots were piled in a corner. Jars with powders of different colors set were on a table. The place had a chaotic sense about it. The smell of fear. I would probably get eaten alive by fleas or rats or bitten by bugs and snakes. At the very least, I would be totally out of my element and inconvenienced to the maximum. I shook my head. I have to go back to Los Angeles to go to the university, I said to Zulika. Doña Zulika smiled in a most eerie fashion that made the hair on my arms stand on end. She patted my hand, her face full of disdain. Then she rubbed my swollen legs with a foul-smelling lotion, which temporarily afforded some relief from the itching. She turned her back for a moment and took from a shelf a jar of light brown powder that looked like ground chocolate. She sprinkled some into a tin cup and added bottled water to it. She gave the mixture a stir, then handed it to me to drink. I looked at Carlos for a sign as to whether or not to drink it. He in turn glanced at Doña Zulika for a cue. Her nearly imperceptible nod caused him to say, "It's all right to drink. Doña Zulika says it will relieve the itching." I took the cup from Zulika's outstretched hands, braced myself for something bitter, and took a few sips. Surprisingly, it didn't taste foul, as one might have expected. I was certain there was coca powder in that jar. As I gulped the rest of the drink down, I gagged a bit, for the pork had been very salty and had given me a great thirst. Doña Zulika stroked my back, then took the cup, surprised that I had drunk its contents so fast. I realized then that she had expected me to sip it slowly. And before I could ask what was in it, the impact of her brew hit me full force. I nearly fell off the chair. The next thing I knew, I was slumped against the mattress on the floor. My body was numb. I couldn't move. I sensed something licking my face. It was a huge dog. I tried to push it away in disgust, but my limbs were rubbery. Then the black dog moved away, and I looked into his yellow eyes. Instantly, I recognized him. It was Manfred, the being Emilito found as a puppy and had raised in Clara's house. My heart leaped with joy. Then, liquid love flowed between our eyes, and I reached out to embrace him. That surge of pure affection gave me the power to sit up. I put my arms around Manfred's neck, but my arms went right through him. Manfred had no substance, and for that matter, neither had I. We sort of blended together in one exuberant ball of bliss. I was so happy to see him that we rolled on the floor, making one furry bundle. And I no longer cared if there were fleas on the floor or if Manfred or I were covered with them. I heard childish squealing, and I didn't think it was coming from Manfred, so it must have been I who was making those sounds. Then someone came and abruptly pulled us apart. I looked up and saw John Michael Abelar standing there, His face was all aglow, and rounder and fuller than I remember. But it was unmistakably he, and he had a very stern expression. "Don't waste your energy cavorting," he said in a gruff tone. "Zulika didn't give you a love potion." "What did she give me?" I wanted to ask, but I couldn't voice the words. Then I realized I didn't have to talk in the normal way. I could just think my question. I heard a female voice near me. It was Nelida, and she could understand what I was thinking. "Zulika did something to boost your energy into the second attention," Nelida explained. "But as usual, it pushed you to the brink and beyond." "But how did Manfred get here?" I asked. "And Mr. Abelar and you?" Mr. Abelar's face softened as he said, "We came to meet you in the presence of the young Nawal, Carlos. But since you were still lost in concerns with yourself, we couldn't meet you in your ordinary state. You wouldn't have given the members of my party the time of day. And I, being responsible for you, couldn't allow that." Nelida added, "I know you are capable of a more exquisite maneuver, Taisha." "Oh, but I would have been honored to meet them all," I protested. "I've waited so long for this encounter." "Then why were you rude and bored to death when you were introduced to some of the members of our party?" Nelida asked. "When was this? I never met anyone." "Of course you did," Nelida said. "Where? When?" I tried to organize my thoughts, but there was no linear structure on which to hang them. "In the house where the fleas bit you," Nelida replied. "You were bored stiff and couldn't wait to get out of there. You didn't even have the courtesy to give them your attention." "But those were just ordinary people, weren't they?" I said. "I didn't know that they were part of the Nawal's sorcery group." "Of course you knew, but being such a superior woman, you didn't have the power to see that, let alone act on it," Nelida said. "Whenever anyone wanted to approach you, you turned your back and snubbed them." "But I don't speak Spanish very well," I protested. "It's not your lack of Spanish, but your self-importance that hinders you," Nelida insisted. "You regarded everyone as poor Indians who weren't fit to wipe your feet." I wanted to protest, but something in me knew she was right. "The young Nawal had to apologize to everyone in your behalf," Nelida continued. "Otherwise, they would have thrown you out on your ear. You're lucky you got away with only a few flea bites. The fleas were relentless with you, and that was the omen. You have to be treated ruthlessly. If Zulika hadn't helped you with her energy, you and I wouldn't be talking now. You would have been booted across that bridge in front of the house, and you would have never returned. Zulika even asked you to stay with her to teach you how to stalk with a double, which you refused for petty reasons." I looked around. In the corner stood a tall lady with her hair in a bun. It was Zulika. She smiled and nodded with brilliant eyes, as if agreeing with all that Nelida had said. I knew that I had flubbed my chance. My sense of self-importance was still overpowering. If left up to my own devices, I always fell back into the pit of superiority and self-obsession I was accustomed to inhabiting. "Couldn't I meet everyone now?" I asked, hopefully. "No, they've already left," Nelida said. "Have they given up on me?" "Practically. Yet you will meet them one by one, depending on your power," Nelida replied. The young Nawal, who is your guide, will take you to meet them. The only one who stuck around was Manfred. Apparently, it doesn't matter to him that you are an imbecile. His affection for you is peerless. I heard a sharp bark, as if in affirmation, and a feeling of love welled up inside me. Likewise, I said, and was about to burst out weeping. In fact, tears had already begun to fall. I moved my arm to wipe them when I felt a warm body next to me tugging at my arm. I turned my head to see a young pretty girl about my age winking at me. She had short, dark brown, curly hair, delicate features, brown eyes, and an eerie smile like Zulika's. I stuck around too because I'm crazy, just like you, she said and giggled. Instantly, her eyes became wild, glowing like a doll that had suddenly come to life. I thought that she would devour me with her tiny piranha-like teeth. I wanted to move away, but she held me down with superhuman strength. As she began to climb on top of me, I screamed for Nelida to get her off me. I thought you came to Mexico to find love, she said in a throaty voice. Well, I'm your man. She gyrated her hips in a lewd motion, then kissed me on the mouth. As I struggled to free myself, I heard a chorus of laughter in the background. You two behave yourselves, Nelida said, and pulled the girl off me. That's Josefina. Don't mind her. She's always direct and to the point. I didn't mean to frighten you, the young girl said in Spanish. She touched my hair affectionately. She was the picture of sweetness and decorum again. But you were such a shit-ass with everyone. I thought you needed a good fuck. My mouth fell open. Such crude language. Didn't give with her delicate appearance. She smiled and nodded, as if I had better believe her. Josefina always speaks the truth, Nelida said, or she doesn't speak at all. Isn't that right, Josefina? The girl nodded mutely. It was then I realized that I had had no trouble understanding Spanish. In fact, I had the certainty that I had learned the language somewhere before, although where, I didn't know. Nelida came to my rescue. One can easily understand a different language in the second attention, she said. Once you bypass the rational mind, you have no difficulty with languages. You used to speak German and Hungarian and some Spanish, remember? That was true. I used to know those languages as a child, but I had forgotten them out of a lack of use. One never forgets, Nelida said. The assemblage point simply moves to a different position where that language is no longer in the foreground. But you can always move back. Now you'd better sleep. You've used up just about all the dreaming energy Zulika gave you. I wanted to ask her how Zulika gave me dreaming energy, but then I remembered that there was something missing. It was as if I had misplaced something that had been with me, but I didn't know what it was. Then I heard a voice, and the missing piece fell into place. I saw Carlos sitting down next to me, and I knew we had known each other for a long, long time. In fact, we had spent a lifetime together. How could I have forgotten the feeling I had for him? I touched his hand and lay down on my left side. Then our hands melted together, and I could no longer sustain his image. My eyelids were so heavy that they closed in spite of my effort to keep them open. Will I see you again? I managed to ask Nelida. Nelida tousled my hair the way she always did. That depends entirely upon you, on how impeccable you are with yourself and others. But it is the new Nawal's duty to bring you to freedom. You have been entrusted into each other's care by the Spirit itself. Trust him, trust him, and support him, because his path and yours are forever entwined. I made her a solemn promise. Then she said something else, maybe even many other things, but I could not remember any of them, because I fell asleep to Nelida's soft commands that sounded like a lullaby. I dreamt I was suspended from a harness attached to a tree branch. Someone was pushing me as if I were on a swing. I looked down. I saw Carlos reaching up to catch my ankles, to give me a push. He was laughing with abandon. Next to him, Emilito was jumping up and down like a big child, wanting to play too. I awoke from a deep sleep. The darkness in the room was intense. It was pitch black. There was no light anywhere. As my eyes became accustomed to the shapes and shadows in the room, I could tell I was lying on the hard mattress. Someone had thrown a blanket over me, and the heat of it made the bites on my legs itch terribly. It was all I could do to keep from scratching them. The rough blanket around my face was suffocating me. I smelled its staleness. It made me sneeze. Carlos was lying near me. From the sound of his rhythmic breathing, I could tell he was asleep. I was glad that my stifled sneeze had not awoken him. I lay there for a long time, afraid to move or get up. I needed to go to the bushes to relieve myself, but fear of encountering a snake or one of the dogs kept me from venturing into darkness. To pass the time, I tried to remember what had happened the previous afternoon. We had come to a fiesta. I had been introduced to a group of people. Then Zulika had given me a potion to drink. It had knocked me out. What followed was too vague to put into thoughts. I remembered seeing Nelida and Mr. Abelar and a young pretty girl I hadn't met before. And Manfred was there too, barking in the background. I remembered seeing the new Nawal, Nelida rubbing my head and telling me things. But then in a flash, they were gone. And I fell asleep to dream haunting dreams. Carlos turned onto his side. I tried to fall asleep again, but I couldn't. Some part of me was wide awake, fully alert, ready to fight danger. A dog was barking incessantly in the distance. Then I must have fallen asleep, for the next thing I knew, Carlos was shaking me, saying it was time to go. He wanted to return to Vikam Station to meet Benny, to look for Pascola masks to donate to the Ethological Museum. I put on the long-sleeve shirt and cotton drawstring pants someone had left by my shoulder bag, and gratefully slipped into a pair of guaraches. As we crossed the wooden bridge on our way back to where we had parked the car, I turned and glanced at the house one last time. In the distance, I saw Zulika waving at me, smiling as if we shared a secret. I waved back, and as our eyes met, I had the certainty that I would meet her again. I would accept her invitation to stay with her, and Emilito would be there too, and my life would change.